Greetings friends and welcome back to our digital workflow. In this episode, I want to make a couple of comparisons. We're going to let Photoshop automatically generate a panoramic image for us. And then we're going to hand paint that exact same image together using layer masks. Which technique is best for you? The results might just surprise you. All right, friends, welcome back to a new Photoshop lesson. In this episode, we're going to be putting together these beautiful San Juan mountains with all of that luscious, amazing forest. So if you will recall, in our previous lesson, we were working in Lightroom and we generated 4 super raw files out of individual raw files that enabled us to edit these images as if they had 8 or 9 stops of dynamic range. We got our super raw files pretty much dialed in to the best we can, and then we exported them out of Lightroom, where we will now assemble them in Photoshop. Now, for this lesson, I want to try something a little bit different. Let's jump into Photoshop really quick, and I want to show you how to automatically photo merge these images together using Photoshop's automatic photo merge tool. So let's go right up here to File. I'm going to come down to Automate and I'm going to select Photo Merge. Basically, there are a number of different options that you can use. I've tried just about all of them and I find that Auto is usually just about the best one. So that's pretty much the default for this. And that's what we're going to do here. So let's browse to the location where our 4 super raw files have been freshly exported. We're going to grab these 4 and I'm just going to open all of those. And as soon as I hit OK, Photoshop will automatically go to work loading each of these individual images into a single Photoshop document, and then it will start to warp and stretch and shift and combine these images into one seamless panorama. Now you're going to see some strange looking stuff as the machine does its work, but that's okay because Photoshop does do a fairly good job of stitching these images together seamlessly, and we'll kind of get a look at how some of those stitches come together in just a little bit. And once the magic is done happening, you can see that we are left with this bizarre looking curved file. Essentially what Photoshop has done is it has gone into each one of these images and it has warped and shifted and changed the actual original square shape of the image into these sort of parabolic curving things that sort of fit together seamlessly. Over here on our layers palette, we can see that each of our individual layers is still present, but it now has been broken up into different masks. So let's take a look at what these look like a little bit closer. If I go over to this section right here and I turn this layer off, I can come in and zoom in right over here and I can see where Photoshop has seamlessly sort of merged these 2 images together. It's created a very complex organic looking mask. If I turn this back on, there's pretty much no way to tell where those 2 images come together. So that one goes off. And as we move our way along this file, let's turn this one off. Here again, we have a very, very complex algorithm that is building these 2 images together in a mask that no human eye can probably ever really pick out. And then finally over here, once again, you can see that we've got this very sort of organic line connecting these 2 images together. Now, this is good, but this is also a little weird because Photoshop has taken the liberty of really warping and stretching our image into this absolutely bizarre shape. Now I know for a fact that this is not precisely how this scene looks because I was standing right there when I shot it. And this is where we start to see certain problems when we allow the computer software to automate all of our creativity for us. Obviously, this is kind of a picture of nothing until we bring some guidelines in and start to crop it down. And the minute that you do that, you are kind of having to sacrifice, some of the original file information that we worked so diligently to acquire. Coming over here, as you can see, this section on the left is just so insanely warped that I wouldn't even use any of that at all. I wouldn't trust any of that information because let's see what happens when we come in over here. We just have this massive amounts of stretching going on for all of the pixels are just kind of being moved around completely. We could probably stand to do a little bit of focus stacking in this particular region. I did actually focus stack this file when I was out there on the scene, but we're not going to worry about that for right now because this is just a branch that's kind of in the foreground over here on the left. And it's also super duper stretched. So let's just kind of take this and we'll kind of cut that guy out altogether. And so of our original, what should be probably about 120 megapixel file, I'd say by the time that we come in here, let's just do a quick little grab of what's in the middle. I'll do a copy merge paste. That way we just have one singular panoramic. And then we'll give this a backdrop so we can kind of tell a little bit easier what's going on. Okay, so as you can see, in just a few short minutes, we have automatically generated a panoramic image. And now that we're not seeing it all warped and stretched, it's not really all that bad. But I do happen to know for a fact that we can do better ourselves when we hand paint this thing together. And that's why I always advocate for doing things by hand. It's kind of the same as a car assembly line. You can choke out a whole bunch of cars on the assembly line, but they're probably never going to be as good as that handmade Italian sports car. So again, if you are into saving time, if you are into automation and you don't mind that your image ends up looking, let's see here, a little wonky, then perhaps this form of automation is going to be just right for you. Again, I know lots of photographers who don't really like to spend a great deal of time in the editing room, in which case a product like this is going to be perfectly satisfactory for them. I, on the other hand, I don't think this is as good as what we can do ourselves. As a matter of fact, I know it's not as good because you can tell with all the warping and stretching that the mountains have become a little bit convoluted. I mean, this section over here is much taller than this section in the middle, even though this mountain is actually the tallest mountain in the whole scene. But again, that's what happens when software does our creative thinking for us. So let's see what happens when we actually build these images together on our own. I'm going to just kind of save this one section right here so that we can have these as a basis of comparison later. So we will just minimize this file and we'll do another one, scripts, load files into stack. I'm going to grab the exact same files that we use for our automation and we're going to blend these together by hand. So once again, Photoshop is essentially just loading each of these unique super raw files into one Photoshop document. So I now have them over here in my layers palette. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And since we are doing all this by hand, we have to first start off by creating our canvas. So image canvas size. I'm going to run this up at about 67 inches because these things usually end up being somewhere in the realm of 70 inches wide. That looks pretty good right there. I'm going to create a new layer and call it back. And I'm going to select a prominent color in the canvas. So one of these oranges right here, somewhere in there. Let's go over here to this layer and make sure we actually get, there we go. And I'm going to fill this back layer with the paint bucket tool. Again, using a prominent color from the image. I'm going to put that down at the bottom. And the reason that we do this, and I've kind of gone over this in a couple of lessons before, is that as we kind of move these images around and try to start lining them up, if you don't have a background, we're basically looking at the back of this sort of checkerboard. This is Photoshop's way of telling you this is sort of the translucent background. And the way that we line these up is that we change our opacity down a little bit, and then we kind of move these layers until they fit just right. But I find myself looking at this checkerboard, at this transparency through into the checkerboard, and find it to be very confusing. So I usually like to just fill a background layer with normal paint. That way, this is a little bit easier on the eyes when you're working with these layers and trying to line things up. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is just kind of eyeball this and get our panoramic relatively close. So I started off with my topmost layer and I moved it over to the left. Now the next layer in the series comes underneath. And what I'm going to do is just kind of move this layer around until I feel like roughly things line up. I'm looking down here at the base of this tree and I can see where these two images line up. So I'm just going to kind of rough that in there. That looks pretty good. Let's grab our next layer and move this over. And I'm going to call this roughly right about there, give or take. And then let's rough this last image in over here, give or take somewhere in there. Okay, so we've got this little tree branch right here, matches this little tree branch right here. Move those guys over, and that's basically what we've got. Okay, so essentially we have kind of a stacked panorama. This is going to be roughly the size and shape of what our final image will look like. And as you can tell, even though we haven't painted this together just yet, the mountains already tend to make more sense to me. They've kind of leveled off. We don't have that strange warping that blew this whole side of the image into a crazy parabolic mess. And we are seeing our image a little bit more true to life. All right, now the next thing we have to do is line up our panels perfectly. So I'm gonna go to my leftmost panel on the top. You can see in the layers palette, my panels are kind of cascading down and to the right. So let's take our top panel, let's go to 50%, and I'm gonna select my second panel because this is where we're gonna move our panels in order to get them lined up just right. I like to zoom in a little bit. And at this point, we are looking for an area where the two panels come together just perfectly. This is typically what we would refer to as the nodal point. Essentially the one section where the two images overlap perfectly. It's normally right in the center of the two images if you did your due diligence and made enough overlap. And right now, I'm basically gonna look at a prominent feature in the landscape and try to use that to line these images up. So right now, I'm looking at this little peak right here and that little peak right there. I feel like we're getting close. So if I move this off to the right, I can see right in this region right here that the image does in fact come together rather perfectly, right about there. So let's drag ourselves a guide in here. And as you can see, as we move off to the right, the images start to separate out a little bit. You've got this ghosting along the mountain. And as we move off to the left, the images, once again, they separate out a little bit over here. But right about there, that's where they come together just perfectly. So that's where we want to focus on creating our seamless stitch when we mask this image together. So let's go back to our first image. We'll go all the way to 100%. I'm going to turn these other two layers off. I don't really need to be looking at them right now. I just want to focus on connecting these first two layers. So as we can see, we're going to create a layer mask on this top left image. I'm going to select the mask itself. I'm going to grab a brush tool and we're going to go to 100% opacity. I'm going to use a soft round brush in order to basically just paint everything from the right side of this guideline over. All that's going to get removed. It's going to get hidden by the mask. So let's increase our brush size nice and big so we don't have to be here all day. And again, with 100% black paint, I'm going to paint this mask and we're going to effectively remove that top layer so that I'm looking at the next layer underneath. So with a quick brush stroke, we have effectively removed that layer. You will remember that when we saw the original automated Photoshop document, we effectively removed pieces of the file, masked them off. That's this. We're doing the same thing here, only we're doing a hand blended job of this, and ours is going to be a little bit softer on the edge. You'll remember in that last automated file, there was a very jaggedy edge. Typically when you're hand blending, you want to make sure that your edges are nice and soft. So we've created our big ticket edit. Let's get in here and really get down and try to refine this cutting edge along this way. Okay, so again, I am using black paint in order to stitch these images together. Black paint, everything to the right of the line, we paint away, everything to the left of the line, we leave. Now, as I can see over here, I have overdone it. I had my giant brush in there and I took a huge swath out of this image, and I've got a little bit of ghosting happening right here. Basically, what all we need to do is switch over to white paint and come in here and just sort of paint this back. This is essentially where the leftmost layer needs to live. And that looks pretty good right there. All right, so my right bracket key makes my brush bigger, left bracket key makes the brush smaller. Just to the right of both of those, there's the backslash key, and when I push that button, I basically get a quick preview of the mask that I'm painting in. This is a very handy tool because, as you can see, we're looking at this pretty up close, and I'm having a hard time telling where these two images come together at all. You can see a little bit over there, and now let's switch back over to some black paint and get ourselves going with this section right here. Painting this side in. Yeah, I've definitely, whoopsie, let's switch over to white paint. I've definitely overdone it with my big fat brush. So let's go down this side. I was trying to get in a hurry to show you that even though this hand painting stuff does take a little bit longer, it's still relatively quick. It's not as quick as the automated Photoshop stuff, but we don't have to worry about all that completely bizarre fringing that we saw. All of those strange and unusual boundary warps that kept getting into our image. I personally don't like that stuff because it's just not natural. Now the end viewer is probably not going to know or care, but if you're neurotic like me and you want to have just beautiful images that stitch together and don't really have a lot of that strange artifacts, you're probably going to want to go in and get in nice and close and blend these together by hand. All right, let's turn that quick mask back off. Switching back to black paint, coming over here, and I'm going to continue painting this side of the mask out so that our image connects beautifully. Already, I'm kind of having a hard time telling where these two images come together. I consider that to be a good thing. Quick mask. Come over on this side a little bit, and again, while we were working in Mother Nature, we had lots and lots of leaves. There's just an enormous amount of contrast and content that's coming in here that camouflages the way these two images come together. So now we look here, and let's clean up any of these little artifacts that we have hanging out. They're a little bit easier to see when you turn your layer off. That looks good there. The clouds, I like to leave kind of a nice little dissolved gradient because clouds are fluffy and they tend to connect a little bit better when you're not doing such a hard line right down the center of them there. All right, when we turn this back on, that looks like a pretty good stitch to me. Okay, let's zoom out just a little bit, and we'll come over and we will repeat the process with this next step. So we've just masked out our first layer. Our second layer is where we now want to target, so I'm going to click on this layer and I'm going to give him a layer mask, and let's reveal the layer underneath. All right, 50%. Now I grab the layer underneath and I'm going to move him until I start to see where these two images come together. I'm kind of looking in this region right here. Let's get in a little bit closer. And yep, it does look like right about there. So we've got this little mountain tip, which is a pretty good focal point to base our things on, but right about there is where these two images look like they come together. So let's put our guideline in here. And again, we can tell everything to the right of this guideline, the image starts to separate out as our sort of wide angle lens parallaxes away. And then to the left, everything starts to separate out once again as our nodal point sort of shifts away from center. So everything to the right of this line, we will once again mask out in order to reveal the layer underneath. So let's go back to this guy, put him back up to 50%. I'm sorry, back to 100%. And we will repeat the process. Again, brush tool, black paint, 100%. I'm gonna come in here and make this nice and big, maybe not as big as our last one. And let's kind of paint out the layer and reveal the layer underneath. And already, this is really starting to come together as a very stunning scene. We got super, super lucky when we shot this image. Just the best of the best conditions that you could ever hope for. Beautiful snow the night before, lots of rain down in the valley that just kind of punched up a whole bunch of extra color saturation onto a bunch of really healthy trees. It was a good year in Colorado for fall colors. All right, let's get in here. This guy down just a little bit and come back to the left side, paint that out just a tad. And here we go. Check with the quick mask. That looks good. Again, I'm right up in this image and I'm having a little bit of a hard time telling where these two stitches come together. So that's a good thing, because anytime that you produce an extra large panoramic image and you hang it in a gallery or a hotel or your home, you can count on other photographers coming up and scrutinizing it very, very closely. And if they can't find any mistakes and or edits where you have stitched this thing together, that's a pretty good thing. Photographers are your strictest critics, right behind your own self. You will always be your toughest critic, but then photographers come next, and then pretty much anybody else who looks at these images, they probably don't care. All the same, we are going to produce the absolute best quality that we possibly can. All right, on to the last one. Let's reveal this layer on the right. Let's go to 50%. And then let's move this layer underneath it until these guys line up. I'm looking right here in this region. Let's zoom in. And yep, it looks like my two images come together rather perfectly right about here in this valley. Bring in our guide. Yep, once again, everything to the left, the images start to ghost apart. Everything to the right, the images start to ghost apart. This is where the nodal axis brings them together just beautifully. So we'll zoom out here. And let's come back to 100%, give ourselves one final layer mask. And we'll increase our brush size once again. Brush, black paint, 100%. And let's just paint that final layer out so that we can really see what is happening over here and the rest of our scene. And already that's looking really good to me. Let's zoom on in. Make sure that this is nice and tight. And here we go. Switch back to white paint just a little bit to make sure that kind of is brought in nicely. Quick mask. All right. Oops, hold on. I'm doing the wrong paintbrush. Switch back to black. Here we go, here we go. And that's looking pretty nice right through there. Keep our quick mask kind of flowing. Again, we've got all these trees that we can use to kind of camouflage our edits just a little bit. Move down through here. A super high contrast forest with lots and lots and lots of visual information is a great place to hide our panoramic stitching together. Right through there, a little bit through there. It's starting to get away from us a little bit. I'm crossing the line, but that's okay. Sometimes you gotta cross the line a little bit to make this look nice and organic. I'll call that good right about there. And again, as we work our way through these leaves, it's going to be extremely difficult for even the most scrutinizing photographer to come and tell where your edits have been. And not that it's a bad thing either. I mean, you're editing together a panorama. It's just stuff you gotta do for modern photography. Alrighty, so when we zoom out just a little bit, we now have our own hand-blended image. Zoom out just a tad there. I'll kind of turn these guidelines off. Let's reach over to this side and we'll crop the image to roughly full size. And as you can see, we now have a perfectly formed panoramic image that we hand painted together, and it doesn't have any of that bizarre warping going on. Let's take a minute to maybe copy our other image over to this file so that we can see them kind of in comparison to one another. All right, so let's see. Let's grab our panorama, and I'll just go up to this layer. So again, Photoshop generates this kind of stretched weirdness where all of your pixels are getting stretched, and anytime that you start stretching pixels, you start losing sharpness out of your file, and that's typically not a good thing. So we took all of these guys and we kind of cropped it down to this right here. Let's do a select all, copy, and we'll go back into our hand blended file and just paste that into the center. I'll put it up on top so we can kind of see what's going on. All right, as you can see, it's a little longer. Photoshop kind of warped it out a little bit longer, but this is the, we'll call this automation, and then everything below it is our hand blended image. So automation and hand blended. So you can see this is hand blended, and I would consider this to be very natural because this image was shot at, I would say, approximately 55 to 60 millimeters. So it's relatively, the focal length is relatively close to the human eye. So you're not getting any strange warping or parallaxing or any major like wide angle distortion in the original image. So this again is our hand blended version, and then right here we have our kind of warped Photoshop version that has cropped a substantial amount of information off to the left. Look over to the left here. This is the Photoshop version that had all the crazy warping to the left. When I turn this off, I now have just a whole bunch of other foreground information that I lost completely out of my first image. So it just goes to show that all of this comes down to your creative preferences. I personally do not like allowing the computer to do all of my creative thinking for me. I would much rather get in there and do this kind of stuff myself. Either way, this is really a beautiful image. I mean, if you were to show this automated version to a friend or post it on your Facebook or wherever, people are probably going to say, wow, that's just strikingly beautiful, because it is. Colorado is a beautiful, beautiful place. We had an absolutely incredible fall season. The colors were popping, the mountains were covered in snow, and we had partly cloudy skies. I mean, you just couldn't ask for a better scene. And as such, I feel like that scene deserves the best treatment that it can get. And so this is the automated version. Once again, I'm gonna turn this off. And this to me just feels a lot more natural. I mean, like I say, I was there, I shot it in person. This is more or less what I remember, not this. So at the expense of quick and easy, I mean, the Photoshop automation tools are definitely very quick and easy, They'll save you a lot of time, but again, in my humble opinion, they do produce a moderately inferior product to what you can do yourself. So this is automation, and this is the regular hand blended image. All right, so we've basically given you what I hope to be a good basis of comparison. And if you are the type of person who likes getting in and sinking your teeth into these files and creating big, beautiful panoramic images, I strongly encourage you to go through and just kind of take the time to hand blend these images together. You can see that you just preserve a lot better detail, you don't have strange warping in your file, and it gives you the opportunity to create the most natural looking image that you can. All right, so that's gonna do it for this particular Photoshop lesson. I hope you had a good time. I hope we learned something, and I hope that this will help to shape your creative decision making in the future. Yes, hand blending does take a long time, but like I say, I personally get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I like getting into these files, and I know for a fact that every last square inch of this image is going to be nice and beautiful when it gets blown up 7 feet wide and put in the hotel next week. All right, that's going to do it for this Photoshop tutorial. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you in the next lesson.